Aloha, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Amber Noguchi, and I'm the director of the Undergraduate Research and Pre-Professional Program at Chaminade University in Honolulu, Hawaii. And it's nice to have you all join us. A little bit about myself. I'm a first-generation college graduate. I earned my bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And then I went on to earn my doctorate in molecular and cellular biology at the University of Washington in Seattle. I taught science at the college level before going into advising. And in this position, I enjoy working with students and helping them find their path. And so I will also allow our panelists, we have a good group here to share with you about MD PhD programs. So I'll maybe I should have Dr. Gorlick introduce himself first.
Amber, thank you. And I'd like to also welcome everybody that's joining us late this afternoon. I'm at Yale School of Medicine. I'm the Deputy Director of the Yale MD PhD program. I am a physician scientist. I'm a gastroenterologist. I see patients, and I also have a research lab that looks at the mechanisms of injury as related to pancreatitis and also to pancreatic cancer. Within the MD PhD program, I do a lot of advising. I also oversee 2 courses for our students, one for our first-year students that strives to link basic and clinical science to human physiology and disease, and then a course later on in their training which teaches our students how to write grant proposals. And a large percentage of our students, although they're fully funded, will submit a grant during their training. Thanks again for coming today, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
And maybe we can have Dr. Sullivan next.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here today. I've been doing the Leadership Alliance meeting probably for about 12 years now. It's been a long time, and I really hope we'll be able to get back in person someday. Really enjoyed meeting people face to face. I'm at Washington University School of Medicine. I've been with the MD PhD program for about 28 years now. My background is not in science. However, I am a Spanish literature major, and I found after completing my degrees that there weren't many jobs in Spanish literature, so I went into academic administration and just happened to end up in the MD PhD program, and it's very rewarding, and I look forward to sharing my thoughts about what you can do to get into an MD PhD program. Thank you.
And then of course, Dr. Williams.
All right. Hi, everyone. I am Megan Williams, and I'm assistant director of the MD PhD program at Vanderbilt, where I mostly do our admissions and recruiting processes. I also run an undergraduate research program for students interested in MD PhD programs, and work with our students on a variety of their initiatives and committees and things that they're involved with as well. I've been a part of the Vanderbilt MSTP leadership team for 7 years now, and prior to that, I got a PhD at Vanderbilt in neuroscience. So been at Vanderbilt for longer than that as well, and involved in the science environment at Vanderbilt for, gosh, another 6 years for my PhD. So we're gonna have a few slides that we put together, and I want to just mention before I forget, since I've thought of it, that we're going to go kind of quickly through the slides because we want to have a lot of time for your questions. So if there's something that you feel like I didn't talk about very much, write it down and or type it. I guess you can just type it and ask the question, and we'll make sure to cover that in more detail later on after the quick slides that we go through.
I think Louis can, yeah, there you go.
All right, so these slides were created by the AAMC MD PhD Communications Committee, which is a group of people that Brian and I serve on that committee, and We try to essentially work on letting prospective students know about MD PhD training. And so we've made these slides to help you learn a little bit more about them. And one of the important questions is always, why a physician scientist? Why should I do MD PhD versus just being an MD or, a physician? And we like to think about it where the physician is someone who uses medicine to help their patients, whereas a physician scientist goes a step beyond that. And they will certainly help their individual patients, but they always also use research to help advance medicine, to help treat patients of the future. And they're really serving at this space kind of in between the lab and the clinic, where they can find these answers to problems and identify the problems and then bring them back into their lab to hopefully be more directly able to help their patients. So they go to medical school and graduate school. So on the slide, it says that, medical school is really aimed to treat people, to diagnose or train people to diagnose and treat patients, whereas graduate school is really to train people to do this rigorous kind of hypothesis-driven research. And so you're getting training in both of those as a physician scientist and through MD PhD programs. Next slide. There are about 100 MD PhD programs across the country. 53 of those programs are now supported by training grants from the National Institute of Health, and those are called Medical Scientist Training Programs, or MSTPs. So you might see MSTP and MD PhD a bit interchangeably, but there is this is the distinction, and all MD PhD, all programs are MD PhD programs, but they're not all MSTPs. But they all have great training, great communities, and so you don't have to go to an MSTP to be trained to be a successful physician scientist. Most MD PhD programs offer financial support for their students in the form of stipends to support their living expenses, as well as tuition for both the medical and graduate school components and health insurance. So this is a large investment that we're making, us and also the government through the National Institute of Health, in training these students, because we feel like they're very important roles that they'll serve in helping to improve healthcare for future patients and solve some of the tough problems in biomedical research. Next. So the goal of an MD PhD program, as I've kind of mentioned, is to prepare these people for a career that combines both research and clinical care. We think the best way to become a physician scientist is through MD PhD training in a combined program, because you're going to get rigorous training in both aspects. And our director of our program always says that you've got to learn how to be a scientist somewhere. Even if you try to just go to medical school, you still have to get more research experience, maybe through medical school or through postgraduate training. So you might as well do it through an MD PhD program where you're really getting that dedicated time to do research. These programs are typically set up where you'll do your first 2 years of medical school, and then you'll often go to graduate school, which usually takes about 4 years to finish your PhD, but that can definitely be flexible depending on how your research goes. And then you'll often come back for an additional 1 or 2 years of medical school. And you've seen that we've kind of mixed the purple and the blue here, because a lot of the programs really try as much as possible to integrate some aspects of one phase into the next, so that students can have some integration of their training and not necessarily forget everything throughout the times in which they might be in one phase versus the other. We also might sometimes cut down on the training. It typically takes about 7 to 8 years to finish these programs, where if you did each degree independently, that might take you more like 8 or 9 or more years. And so doing them in a combined program will help cut down on some of that time to training. You can do many fields for your PhD. I think almost all programs will have anything in the biomedical sciences that you might be interested in, but there's a lot of other options, things that we kind of traditionally refer to as non-traditional PhD training options, but they're becoming common as well. Things like sociology or anthropology, engineering, informatics, public health. A lot of different types of things that you might be interested in are possible in the PhD in MD PhD programs. Next. This graph looks weird on my screen, so sorry about that. Takeaway here is that there are a lot of things that you can do with your career as a physician scientist, but most graduates from MD PhD programs go into academia. So that's the big dark blue wedge there. About 60% of our graduates work in academia. Another group of them work in other places, like for federal places like the NIH or places like the CDC. They might work in industry, research positions in industry or other types of institutes. And then there's also some of them that go into private practice where they're really only doing medicine and seeing patients. That isn't ultimately the goal of our programs because, like we mentioned, we're really putting a lot of money into these training programs and training students. And so we really want them to be doing careers where they're going to be doing research as well as seeing patients. And that's a pretty important aspect that we'll look at in the admissions process as well. They also do a lot of different kinds of research. So in the bar graph, you can see that about more than half of them do what they call basic science research. Another large group we're calling their research translational. And then there's a portion that do patient-oriented or health services research. And if you look at these graphs, you can see that this adds up to more than 100%. And that's because a lot of physician scientists might say that they do multiple types of research and put themselves into more than one of these types of categories. And this data from these two graphs is from surveys of actual graduates of our programs. It's like thousands and thousands of graduates and what they're doing. So it's a great landscape to see what people do in their careers. Next. So now we're going to switch gears and talk just a little bit about how to prepare and apply to MD PhD programs. So these are some of the things that we look at. One of the things that we really like to highlight is that programs really do look at a holistic review of your application. We really do think about all of the different types of things that you've done, all of the individual aspects of your experience that you're going to bring to our program and into the training environments that we have. A few of the things that we'll look for and evaluate are going to be your commitment to a career as a physician scientist. You know, why do you want to do this compared to doing medical school or PhD? Why is it that you think that this is the best path for you to reach your career goals? We do want you to have some experience in caring for others, and this is what you might think of as like clinical experience or clinical shadowing or volunteering. We certainly realize that opportunities have not been as plentiful over the last few years with the pandemic, and that sometimes gaining shadowing opportunities can certainly be challenging even without a pandemic. And so we, as MD PhD programs, recognize that our students and applicants are going to be doing a lot more research, both in their preparation to apply and in their future careers. And so we often will expect there to be perhaps less shadowing and less clinical exposure than a straight medical school applicant. And we're certainly understanding of, you know, how the pandemic might have inhibited the opportunities to get some of those clinical experiences. We do expect there to be some explanations in your application and experiences that let you know that you are going to medical school, you do enjoy working with patients, you do understand what a physician's role is, and that's something that you want to do as well. We'll also look at academics, so thinking about things like Gpa and Mcat. Those are things we'll look at just to make sure that we think you've got the preparation to be able to succeed in medical and graduate school. We'll look at your life experiences, your leadership, your types of extracurriculars and things you've been involved in. But the thing that certainly is the most important thing is going to be your research experience. That's going to be the area of the most focus for MD PhD program applicants. And I believe the next slide I talk a bit more about that research experience. The next slide. So we said research is one of the most important things. We expect you to have a pretty good amount of research experience. And what does that mean? We want you typically to have some sort of sustained type of experience, something that, is might include time during the school years. If you are at an institution where you're not going to have a lot of opportunity to do research during the school year, hopefully you'll have had some summer experiences, like you might be doing, this summer, and maybe multiple summer experiences. If you didn't feel like you got a lot of research in undergrad or weren't at an institution that had a lot of opportunities to do research, that's when people might choose to take some time off after undergrad and do a gap year. It's not required to do a gap year or two, but it's something that if you didn't feel like you got the experience previously, that you can certainly do. If you got a lot of experience in undergrad, you don't have to take a gap year. Like I said, certainly not a requirement. We expect you to probably have had some experiences where you maybe been involved in your own project, testing a hypothesis, not just running a protocol that someone else told you to do, but really thinking about the project that you're doing and coming up with some of the ideas and interpreting the results on your own. It's great to have opportunities to present your research, whether those are virtual or in person. We know a lot of things over the last few years have been virtual for all of us. So those types of things can look really good and have can even help prepare you for discussing research in like an interview setting as well. But publications are not required. I think students often think that they need one. We understand that different lab environments have different types of criteria for being included in publications. That sometimes undergrads get kind of like the project that might not work out, and so they're not always set up for the most success. And so that's certainly not something we would require. Of course, it's great to have one, but definitely not something that is required to get into MD PhD programs. Next. This is just some statistics based on kind of last year's data. And last year, there were about 6,000 people in the country that were enrolled in MD PhD training programs. For the cycle of people who would have started last summer. So we don't quite have this updated yet for the people that will start kind of this summer and fall. But for those who started last summer, there were about 2,000 applications for MD PhD programs, and that is compared to more than 60,000 MD applications. So it's certainly a smaller pool of applicants and a smaller group of people who ultimately choose to select this pathway. Applicants are applying to about almost 16 programs on average. I think as we've seen virtual interviews, that's allowed people to sometimes apply for more programs because they're not having to pay as much money to travel to interviews and also take as much time sometimes to travel for interviews. We also had 750 of those, about 2,100, I guess, applicants that matriculated into MD PhD programs. So about a third of all of the applicants are entering into an MD PhD program. There's also a subset of applicants who get accepted and decide that maybe the MD pathway is actually a better path for them. So there are more than 750 people that are accepted as well. The incoming students make up about 50% women, so it's great that we've achieved gender balance in that matriculating class. And we also have some diversity. We have about 12% of our students who are from backgrounds that are racial and ethnic backgrounds traditionally underrepresented in science and medicine. And then another group that also would identify as multiracial and ethnic as well. So those might belong in some of those underrepresented categories too. This is certainly not something that we're saying we're satisfied with as a community. I think ultimately we all would like the representation in our programs of students to mirror the types of populations that physician scientists serve. So, maybe more of like the population in the US. So we're certainly always looking for ways to improve and increase and better support our trainees from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds in our programs. Next. So here's some stats. I think we like to show this because people always stress a lot about things like GPA and MCAT. And you can see on the top the mean and range of our applicants compared to the mean and range of the accepted students. But if you look on the right side, we really like to show you that the ranges are actually pretty broad. So even though sometimes those averages can be a little high and can look a little scary, there really are extremely broad ranges of both GPA and MCAT. And so this shows you a little bit about that holistic review that I was talking about. You don't have to have, the top MCAT score, the top GPA. We really do look at all those other things, including research experience and all the things you've done, the depth and breadth of your life experiences that you're going to bring to our program and our community, because we know that all those diverse viewpoints are really important to solving these important problems in biomedical sciences and treating our diverse patient populations that we'll all treat in the future. So when you look at this slide, I want you to, look at the mean, but also think about those ranges because those are really broad, and we do look at a lot of factors when we consider admissions. Next. All right, so I think this is one of our final slides. So one thing I just wanted to mention here is that, preparing and applying to programs is kind of a long drawn out process. So you're going to have to start, a couple of years ahead of time thinking about the types of courses that you need to take, getting your research experience, getting some of those clinical experiences. And then more than a full year ahead of the time that you want to actually apply, you want to start that you want to matriculate, you want to start preparing your application. So a couple of months ago, our current applicants probably started working on their essays and getting things together. And then in the summer, the application opens for you to apply. So we're all receiving applications furiously right now and sending out secondary applications. And then in the fall, you typically go on a number of interviews. And then hopefully in the winter, you'll get multiple acceptances and you can decide which program it is that you might want to join. And then sometime in the following summer or fall, depending on the program's timeline, you'll typically start an MD PhD program. And a lot of times they start in June or July. So I think people think of school starts in August, but a lot of these programs can start a bit earlier with maybe some summer research rotations and things like that. So it's certainly a long drawn out process for everybody, for us too, but we provide a lot of support for students and applicants throughout that time. Next slide. So these are just some resources. Definitely maybe screenshot this. I think that AAMC website has a lot of information. It's could be better organized and we're working on that, but definitely a lot of stuff there. So if you're interested, click around and look at that. There's also great info from the NIH, and I've included our emails, so we're happy to answer questions beyond today if you think of something that you forgot to ask. And then I also just really encourage you on that last section to just reach out to people. You're going to have perhaps people at your institutions or your summer research program institutions that might be involved, in programs or have done MD PhD programs or know someone who's an MD PhD, and ask those people, ask the mentors and the directors of your programs and the MD PhD students that you might be able to connect with. Ask the people who run the programs. We're always happy to help. So don't be afraid to reach out and network with these people and get advice and ask your questions. Like I said, they're truly happy to help. And I think sometimes prospective students don't feel like they can ask these questions. And so please know that people are accessible to you to help you. All right, I think that's it for the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. So students, any questions that popped in your mind while we were listening? So I see here in the Q&A. So what are a few things that prospective MD PhD students should avoid during the application process or interviews?
I will start. I think one of the things I see is not really being prepared to talk about your science. I think really the science is the most important part of the research that you've done. And I think the more practice you can get at doing that, the better. And that's why Dr. Williams had mentioned the giving presentations. That's a great opportunity for you to learn how to talk about your science to somebody who's not an expert in your field. So talking to your lab mates, that's one thing, right? But being able to talk to someone who's outside your field is important. And I guess the other part of that is being able to talk to another person about their science when you're not expert in it, because that's what your interviews are going to be like. They'll ask you about your research and you'll describe it. They'll ask you a bunch of questions. They'll evaluate you on your ability to think on your feet, and are you thinking, mechanistically about the problem? Are you thinking about the broader issues of your research, or are you just really narrowly focused? And but on the other hand, you have to show some mental agility to be able to listen to someone else's description and then ask them, good questions about their research. So I think talking science is probably one of the most important things you can do in addition to doing research.
So maybe I can add to what Ryan said. I agreed with that, and I think one of the things, because you're interviewing for an MD PhD, to be a physician scientist. They want you, even if you're doing very basic science, to understand how this might be applicable to human, if you will, health or disease. And so think through that and be ready to respond and understand what the ramifications are. The other thing that we look for is your impetus for wanting to enter an MD PhD program, and why are you choosing to earn both degrees and spend an extra 4 years in training. And I think that's to be certain you understand, if you will, the job description of both, and that there's a good reason to wish, like you want to wish to combine both avenues of training.
I think the other thing that is helpful to sometimes remember is that we used to say, which when we were in person interviews, that, from the time that the plane lands until it takes off, you're interviewing, right? And so I think the time you log on to your computer and log off, you're interviewing. And so I think just remembering that the one time is that there might be some like kind of student only sessions, and you can maybe be a little more free to ask all of your questions to students, but of course if you do something terrible, it might get back to somebody, but I think just remember that the entire time that you're on Zoom, that you're at the interview, you're interviewing, and engage and be a part of that process, have questions prepared, make sure you do your homework on the program in the school, and you might do a lot of interviews really close together and it all blends together, but make sure you ask unique questions about that school. Let them know that you care about their program and you've done the research. Don't ask about something that they just told you about in their welcome session an hour before, unless it was more detail, but not the same thing they've already covered, because we've definitely had that happen as well. Really be engaged for that time that you're there, so that we know that you're interested in us, that this is something that you're committed and dedicated to.
And I'll just add in as a general reminder for this, and also just kind of as you're going through your process and the application, is to watch the communication with the program people, and just if you have questions, right, like professionalism and using a professional email, that's always helpful, and especially with the staff, right, because sometimes they also are able to give input as well. So
let's follow up on that, actually, because I think this is one thing that's different between MD PhD programs and MD programs. We admit you and we live with you for the next 7 or 8 years, right? I'm not saying that med school MD admissions committees don't care, because they do, but their job is to evaluate and admit students, and then their job's done and they start on the next cycle. For MD PhD, that's just the start of our relationship with you, and we're going to be working with you for as long as it takes. Sometimes it might be 9 or 10 years. It just depends how the thesis goes, right? And so if we don't get a sense that you would fit in our program, or or that we get a sense that you might pose some additional challenges to us, we may not want to make an offer of admission to you. So that's just something to be aware of, is that when you join an MD PhD, you are joining a community that will be with you for a long period of time. And we want to make sure that all members of the community are going to really enrich that community, because we do learn so much from one another.
Any other questions? So one thing that a question that I get a lot from my students at the undergraduate level is, how do they balance classes like the science prereqs that they need for med school, but then also their research, as well as clinical experiences and volunteering?
Well, I'll jump in. I'll start because I loved being a student, and I took as many classes. I took like at least 21 hours each semester. I just loved going to class, and I didn't worry about GPA or things like that. And I'm not saying you should be GPA driven. However, I think you need to balance things truly. And for instance, students will ask, well, should I do a double major? And it's like, well, if it really matters for what you want to do, then yeah, do a double major, but it's not going to impress us. We won't even notice if you've done a double major, to be honest with you. And so I think you have to approach this as, yeah, have a rich and take a rigorous courses as an undergrad, but don't feel that taking a whole lot more courses than the normal load would be will somehow impress us, because it really won't. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I review the application. I go through the courses very quickly, and I just look for things that stick out, like a bunch of C's would stick out. Particularly if you kept that had C's throughout your time. If you have a bad semester or bad year, we understand. But if you're struggling throughout, then that would be an issue. And so I think you want to make sure that you get your money's worth out of your undergraduate program, but you don't overdo it, because I think really what gets you into an MD PhD is your research. And if you can't do as much research because you're taking too much in the way of coursework or have other outside commitments, then I think you might be hurting yourself. And the other thing is also with activities, you don't have to do a whole lot. Really, your primary undergraduate activity would probably be research. We understand that. And so we don't expect you to have done a whole lot of other things. You have to have some, you have to show you're well-rounded, and certainly that's important for the medical admissions committees as well. But don't spread yourself too thin, I guess, is to sum all that up.
I think maybe to underscore what Ryan said, I think it's easiest and most useful when you're evaluating a person's research credentials. We want to see that the person is really dedicated to this, and it didn't start in the last semester of their senior year. And honestly, that would have eliminated me from the competition, but those programs didn't exist when I was in college. So I would encourage you all to start it as early as you can in your college career. And most institutions really do offer substantive research opportunities. And there's also a number of summer opportunities which are really target MD PhD students at numerous institutions, and encourage you to look at those, because they're going to teach you more about what it is to be an MD PhD, help prepare you for your application, and give you some additional research experience. The other thing is that my personal bias is to avoid multiple research experiences. It's okay to have a few, but I've seen applications where the applicant is in a different lab every 6 weeks for the entirety of their college career, and it's very difficult to get a letter from a research mentor from a person who's done that, or for someone we would judge to be a qualified research mentor. So a research mentor's letter is important in your application, but we generally like to see that letter coming from someone who's been in contact with you for at least several months, and ideally for several semesters.
I like to think too with this, these kinds of things, like kind of 2 points. And one is thinking about, kind of quality over quantity, right? So anything that you're involved in, like we just mentioned with the research, like longer term, you want to be doing, things more engaged in less things versus a lot of things, but only a little bit engaged. So trying to think about that, that principle. And then also, try to do things that you're passionate about, and don't think about it as like doing all the things you have to do or checking all these boxes, because I know that's a really common way that students look at it. But we want to see your involvement, certainly a lot of research, but the other things that you might choose to do, the types of organizations or volunteer work or other things that you get involved in really do make a difference if they're things that you're excited and passionate and dedicated and motivated about because you like them, because you enjoy doing them, not just because you think you should be the president of the science club because it looks good on your medical school or MD PhD application. But instead, maybe you're choosing to be in a band because that's what you're passionate about. And through being in that band, you helped get some leadership skills because you were like in charge of the band and setting up a bunch of their gigs. And, you know, that's okay if it's something like that. It's about doing the things that you like, because you'll be able to commit and sustain your involvement there, and probably tell us a lot of really important transferable skills and characteristics and qualities that you learn from being involved in those things. And that's how you can show us that you're going to come to our program and be well-rounded, you know, great community members at our program. So I think sometimes thinking about it like, what do I like to do? Let me find those things versus what are the things I have to do in order to get in, can be helpful. Aside from research, you got to do research, and you should have some clinical experience. But for those other things, I think it can get overwhelming trying to be in all the clubs and all the, you know, all the volunteering. So just think about that as you say yes and you decide what it is that you want to do.
And so kind of as a follow-up, would you say that most students would have like 1 to 2 years of research experience just from the chat? But also, second part is for students coming from rural communities or, you know, an institution in a rural community, what should they do?
I'll jump in. I'll answer the second part first. I think if you're coming from a community where there are not a lot of research experiences, I think you really need to think seriously about a post-bac experience of some sort. You know, this year's better than 3/4 of the people that applied MD PhD are coming out of a gap year situation. So it's fairly common that people are doing it. And these are even individuals who maybe had a lot of research experience as an undergrad. A lot of different reasons for doing gap years, but I would think it's definitely advisable if you're coming from an institution that does not have a lot of research opportunities for you. You've just done like summer research programs at various schools. Committing to a year or two post-baccalaureate research is going to be very helpful, I think.
I think the other advantage, Brian, to considering a post-bac is to help you in the decision-making process. Is this the life you really want? And especially if you haven't had much research experience, I think it's really critical to have an in-depth experience. And you know, some folks find out that they just have a much greater affinity for patient care and involvement than doing research. And without that exposure, you wouldn't know it. And I think that's outcome is actually best for both sides of the equation, the institution and the students. So I think it also, post-bacs gives you time to mature. And I think that all of us, you know, can say when we're looking at an application, that's one of the things that we subtly evaluate. Is this a mature, you know, individual? It's very critical, I think, in medical training and when you're embarking on this path, and we have all kinds of measures of maturity. But I do think experience is very important, both research and clinical experience, in deciding on which path you're going to follow.
Thanks. Oh, go ahead.
Oops, sorry, I was just gonna, the first part of the question about kind of the amount of time. I think 2 years is common if it's mostly undergrad research. I think if you've only got 1 year, that's probably a bit light. If it's just kind of part-time during the school year, I think that's more common to have 2 years if it's part-time undergrad with maybe a summer. And then of course, you know, full-time post-bac research would be give you more time. If you've got 3-4 years of undergrad research, you've known about MD PhD for a long time, and this is what you want to do, it's okay to apply right away. That certainly we have those people in our programs too. But if that's not you, if you didn't get that type of experience, then yes, what they said, take those gap years.
And I would just add, you know, yeah, if you are that person that Megan mentioned who has had a lot of research as an undergrad, definitely apply. Don't feel like you need to do the gap year unless you're trying to figure out whether you really want to do, you know, MD PhD. Because one thing we're concerned about is not just time to degree, but age to degree. And, you know, if you delay, you know, 2 years or 3 years, then, you know, it's 8 years in the program, then 3 or 4 years as a resident, and then a fellow, and, you know, you're in your 40s before you actually get your faculty position. And so our concern is that if you string this out too long, that it may be harder for you at the other end, on the other end, to continue in an academic career. So that's just something to think about.
And another suggestion, if you're looking for postbacs or summer research programs, a lot of the medical schools have these types of programs, right? And so it's a good way to network and make connections, and then of course build that the relationship for when you do want to apply. So, okay, so another question in the chat, advisors have suggested an MD PhD if someone wants to do clinical research to allow the person to better look at treatments. So is this wise, or is a PhD more valuable if the person is drawn to designing novel therapeutics versus treating patients?
Maybe I could start with that response. So one of the most dramatic changes I've seen in our MD PhD training program is the advancement of clinical science. And to do that at an academic level, I think is really a very separate training path from doing basic sciences. So we have students involved, probably around a quarter to a third of our class involved in social sciences. They're involved, they do epidemiology, some do bioinformatics, and they use very, very sophisticated approaches to doing clinical science and translational science. And the skill set is quite different from those doing basic science. So I think you need to, think about your goals early on and how you see yourself in 10 to 15 years before you embark on one of those two paths. What I personally found is I primarily do basic science. We're trying to take our work to really to involve patient care and therapeutics. And so I do that by collaborating with people that are really specialists in clinical science and clinical studies. I should mention also, not all programs vary in to what extent they will, provide training in clinical sciences and social sciences. So you do need to look at individual programs and explore them if you're interested in the more clinical sciences.
Yeah, I would point out that the resources that were on that last slide, the Aamc resource, you have to dig a little, but you'll find well, there are two things. One is there is a section on doing a PhD in a non-basic science type field. And so they have some information on that. And then each program on this document indicates whether or not they have PhDs in non-basic science type fields. That'd be a good place to start.
Okay, so I'm gonna type into the chat some of those links that were just mentioned. And then another question. Okay, so kind of in the opposite situation. So what if you have a lot of research experience, right? But not enough clinical. So would you recommend also taking a gap year for this situation?
And that the thing is, that's going to be school dependent. So for instance, at my school, Washington University, all of our acceptances have to be approved by the medical school, and they want to make, and we want this as well. We want you to be a strong MD, right? Because as Megan pointed out in her presentation, about a quarter of our graduates will eventually end up going into private practice. And so we want to make sure that you're going to be a great physician as well as a great researcher. And so we're definitely going to look at that. And so if I think COVID has made things challenging, and so I think things are a little bit more relaxed than they were. But in the past, if somebody didn't have any clinical experience, coming into the admission cycle, there's no indication that they were going to get any. Frankly, we would not interview them because we knew that our medical school would not, they would not pass muster with the medical school admissions committee. And so I think, but do you need a whole year? Probably not. I think what you would probably do during that gap year would be do research, but also find clinical exposures that you can get during that period of time?
I think that's actually probably one of the most difficult questions that will be asked today, as far as being able to resolve it for you. And it's unfortunate in New Haven, we have a number of undergraduates in pre-medical track, and there's virtually no opportunities for them to shadow. And it actually has a lot to do with how hospitals and institutions are insured, not HIPAA. And so I really encourage students to think about going home and contacting their childhood pediatrician, and but finding some opportunities to shadow perhaps outside of New Haven. But it can be really an obstacle, I think, for applying to medical school. And I guess like WashU, we also have to clear all our applicants through the medical school, and they look very carefully at exposure to medicine and volunteering experiences as important criteria for acceptance.
I have a quick follow-up to that. So for students that are interested in going into psychiatry, especially with HIPAA, right? Like, how do they get their shadowing or shadowing or clinical hours?
I think it doesn't necessarily have to be in a specialty they're interested in going to. So first of all, they haven't really had medical training. So only a small percentage of them who enter medical school end up pursuing the clinical practice they thought they might. So they've had very little clinical exposure. And in my mind's eye, Amber, it's more understanding what the role of a physician is, the nature of the relationship to a patient, the understanding that that's almost a singular relationship in our society, and understanding the dedication that it takes and, really sacrifice to be involved in medical care. And I think the way, at least I view it, and it's viewed here, you can gain that from just about any substantive clinical exposure. I think later on in life, when you're applying for residency, then that time you need to worry about having some exposure in the areas that you're interested in, especially if you're going into very competitive residencies, such as ophthalmology, ENT, dermatology. You have to have specific experience in those before you'll get a fellowship.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so another question, how do you maintain relationships with research faculty that you work with if you're not applying to graduate school immediately? And so in this case, the student did research as a rising sophomore through a summer program.
So I think this is a great question and a great thing to do. So I think you can email them. I have someone that actually will send emails like maybe once a semester. So it's not, not too overwhelming, but they're saying like, this is what I've been up to. This is what I'm doing. Here's my future plans. That's great. You can even have a few people you're emailing that same email to, right? They'll never know. I'm quite sure that's what's happening with the student. So I think emailing them, if you're presenting research, whether it's your research you did that summer or your research you did somewhere else, letting them know, hey, I've got this conference coming up. If it's virtual, maybe they can attend or see your presentation, engaging that way. If you've decided that you know what you want to do, like maybe when you wrote or when you did the research there, you weren't really sure what your pathway was. And since then you've maybe made some more concrete decisions or you're still working through it, maybe you email them and ask them for some help or some advice or conversation or to meet again over Zoom because you've got some questions as you're kind of figuring out your future. I'm sure they would be happy to have these types of, conversations and meetings and to hear from you as well. So certainly engage with them. If you think that they might be at a conference you would be at, which sometimes might happen, definitely touch base with them there as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, and it's important in doing this that you don't wait till like the last minute, like it's like, well, I'm applying in May, you ask them for a letter or tell them you're applying. I mean, maintain this relationship. I mean, networking is incredibly important in science, and I think my feeling is that faculty want to hear what you're doing, and it can help them because if they're on a training faculty on a grant or something, and they may want to say something about what their past trainees have done, and so I think that helps them out, and make sure they know that you're applying MD PhD, because sometimes you'll get a letter from a primary science mentor, and they'll talk all about this person. They'll talk about the research, but and at the end of the letter, I think that they will make an amazing doctor, amazing physician. And so then we're left to think, well, are they telling us that they don't think they should do the PhD, or so I think it's important that you let them know that you are applying MD PhD, and let them know why you're doing that, and tell them that the letter should reflect that, because when those come across, those sorts of letters, it does introduce doubt into our mind that somebody who apparently or seems to know you well, and you spend a lot of time with, that they don't know that you're applying MD PhD.
Good point. Okay, so another question, is virtual shadowing something also taken into account when reviewing an application?
Yeah, I mean, we understand that things are not as easy as they were before COVID, and so we have seen that, and we do accept that as being a legitimate experience.
We have I guess, a handful of minutes left if we have any other questions.
I think maybe one I can bring up, Amber, and Megan touched on this nicely, but it's a question that I often am asked, and that is, how are the programs funded, and especially in the context, do students have to apply for grants? I mentioned that certainly just 80% of our students apply. I know many of the students from Brian's program apply also. And is there a consideration for medical school debt for MD PhDs? It certainly, although there's some schools that are working to give a great amount of relief for tuition, it can be an obstacle and something you're concerned about. And I just wondered if there's some general communication and principles and how programs are structured for funding the students in MD PhD programs.
Well, I'll just, MSTP, those should be fully funded. That's one of the things at the NIH, when they give us the grant, they expect that we're going to fully fund the students, cover all the tuition, and provide a stipend for years 1 through however long it takes. If it takes 8 or 9 years, that we would be funding them that way. Most MD PhDs, non-MSc MD PhDs, are structured that way as well, but it is worth checking out, just finding out whether or not they will be providing full funding. As far as I know, schools do not require that MSTP schools do not require that people write fellowship grants in order to get funded. Some may incent students, give them incentives, so a bonus if they get a outside fellowship, because it saves the institution some funding. But I don't think anybody requires that, if it's a funded MSTP, that there are any requirements that you apply for funding.
And tuition?
Tuition should be fully covered again under MSTP. And actually, I just saw something. I couldn't help myself. There's this thing called Student Doctor Network. I saw a posting today. Somebody was writing saying, "Well, I'm in an MD PhD, but they don't pay for the medical school. I'm going to have to pay for med school tuition on my own. And should I do this or not?" And so there are, I think, that may be a case where only the PhD years are funded in a few places. So that's something you need to check out.
And for the application, if someone has multiple research experiences from different fields, what can you suggest in preparing their personal statement?
Maybe I'll make it comment. I would select the topic that you have the greatest experience in and that you could most easily discuss and really emphasize that. I think Brian mentioned in the beginning, most important thing about your interview is going to be really your ability to discuss your research. And if you list 10 different experiences and you get down to the bottom of your list and they're interested in having to discuss that and you're really not able to, it can certainly work against you. So I recommend in students, even with a few experiences, that they really in their essay emphasize what they really want to talk about, what they feel most accomplished in, and mention the others as experience, but don't give them as much time or in the essay.
And the other thing I would say about the essay is it's not a lab report, right? I mean, you really need to write something that's readable and recognize that your audience is not expert in your field, right? And sometimes this stuff, the essay is so dense, it's hard for us to figure out, what they actually did. And so convince us through the essay. First of all, tell us why it's important. Why should you even study this? And then what the big question is and what hypothesis you're addressing. And then tell us about the approach you took and what your results were and how you interpret those results. If you follow that for your major research experiences, then that will give us a good idea of, okay, yeah, you have an understanding of the field and you understood your project and you told us what you did on the project and then you interpret the results. So, that helps us out a lot when we're trying to figure out whether, we feel that you would be somebody who's a good candidate for the program.
And can you talk about balancing the MD and PhD workloads? So any recommendations or how to handle?
Well, I'll say in the old days, because well, Fred may be about as old as I am, I don't know, but in the old days, everybody talked about the 80-20 split, 80% in lab, 20% in clinics. I don't know if that was ever true, but that's what people always talked about, that what the outcome would be. Now we see it's all over the place, and some people maybe 100% in lab, or maybe only attend clinics 1 or 2 weeks a year. Other people may be much more clinically oriented. Maybe they're 50 or even 70% in the clinics. It is kind of all over the place, and you have to sort of figure out based on what your interests are, where you'll go. And that's not a decision you'll make while you're in the MD PhD outcome. That's a decision that you make later after you, and part of your clinical field may dictate that in a way. If you're a neurosurgeon, it's hard to only do neurosurgery 2 weeks out of the year. I mean, I don't want my neurosurgeon to be, somebody who doesn't do it every week. So, so there are some fields that are going to be more amenable to being a physician scientist who's doing a lot of research versus others. But it doesn't matter. We need physician scientists in all disciplines, not just in, hematology or in pathology. We need them in all sorts of different kinds of disciplines. And so if you're interested in ophthalmology or surgery, something that's special, procedure intensive, that's fine. You'll be able to find a way to put together a research enterprise that will fit within that discipline.
And I know we're at time, but can we just quickly answer if a student is around a 3.3 GPA, what can they do to help improve their application to be accepted?
I think a couple of things that we will look at when we're looking at GPAs are certainly explanations. If it was a tough year, tough semester because you were overcommitted to too many things, or because you had something happen in your personal life, or you just, first 2 years were hard because you were adapting to college and it was a lot more rigorous than maybe what you were used to in high school. Tell us those things, right? Let us know about those types of challenges and explain them. And how did you potentially overcome them? We want to know how you're going to be able to succeed in medical school. So let us know, what types of skills and strategies you've learned to succeed in maybe more advanced coursework, or the challenges, whether they're personal, that you dealt with, how you maybe got through those, and how you might get through something that were to rise in the future. I think those types of explanations can be very helpful. This is also where sometimes people might take like a post-bac or master's program that actually has some additional advanced coursework. And I don't think you have to do that unless you have like a GPA or academic kind of challenge and you want to show us that you have that abilities to succeed. But it is an option sometimes to show that you can do well in more advanced coursework. So those are some possibilities. We also have the MCAT. So there are, another piece of evidence that can sometimes help. So sometimes if we'll have students who have maybe a lower GPA and have some really great explanations, and we feel comfortable with their ability to do well in medical school, and they've done pretty well on the MCAT, so we can see that they've learned some of that content. Those types of things can also help give us some evidence. So that's kind of what we'll look for when we're looking and evaluating GPAs.
Any final comments? I think that's good. We got through all the questions. So thank you all, panelists. Thank you for joining us. Students, thanks for joining us as well, and hope you all have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.